Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to you lovely folks joining me here nice and early over at Marvel Snap Zone. Welcome in for a first look at some of our favourite and possibly some of the sweeter decks coming out of the release of Series 4 and Series 5. It is possibly the most exciting time in Marvel Snap's history. All kinds of buzz around new stuff, new cards, and new potential. And today we want to take the time to take a look at some of our favourite and possibly better decks that we've seen up and around on social media, in Discords, in our deck builder, and on stream ourselves over the course of the last few days. So you can have an idea of maybe if these are some things you want to play towards, buy cards for yourself, or try out if you already have picked them up from caches or the token store. Series 4 and 5 have been available for several days and have definitely created the biggest buzz since global release, and why it is still definitely very early to measure the real impact these 16 cards will have on the metagame. It's already pretty undeniable that some of these cards have helped upgrade existing archetypes and maybe even spawn some new ones. In this video we're going to highlight some of these decks which seem to have gotten the better of this early forming metagame, including one or several cards from Series 4 or Series 5. Of course, there are still going to be some gems out there to discover in the metagame that have not been found yet, as for now most players have only collected 2 or 3 of the cards from across the 16 and simply don't have access to everything. As time progresses, I wouldn't be surprised to see this list grow much longer, and our next tier list should probably feature decks that won't be a part of this article. As always, with stuff like this, folks, please do keep in mind that videos like this are opinion pieces. It is, of course, what we think, and that's only worth as much as you want it to be worth, and of course we are human and don't necessarily know everything either. So we can obviously never picture the perfect vision of an environment in a card game, and the Marvel Snap acquisition system is making it even more difficult than normal. So let's talk about a few cards that have managed to make an impact in just a couple of days. The first deck here you can see on screen already is Sera Valkyrie. It might be because she was relatively easy to figure out, or because she's played in one of the best decks already, but Valkyrie has found a lot of great allies in the Sera Miracle build. Her biggest contributions is that she offers an alternative win condition when the deck doesn't draw into the now slightly nerfed Sera, and will help reward you for playing an on-curve style type of game when you don't draw Sera. We can see the inclusion of Bast in this list potentially in the future. It's not something we've had the chance to test out as a replacement to a card like Forge, as it does a very similar job but to your entire hand. The drawback there, of course, is that Bast cannot be played on turn 6 as a surprise, where Forge can, adding stats your opponent did not expect. Otherwise, the only card that has more than 3 power in this deck is Sera, meaning that a card like Bast might simply feel like a solid play at any time throughout the game, even if you end up using Killmonger to get rid of it later. One could also consider running a card like Deathlock if they feel like the extra body is worth a lot in a deck like this. Let's get back to Valkyrie, however, and why she's so good in this build. First of all, she basically always wins you a lane when you have 3 cards there on turn 6 already, as long as Mojo or another slightly nerfed Angela are in there alongside those 3 cards. Or if you destroy Nova later in the same turn, she will guarantee you a lane victory that way. The reason for this is what we should be revealing, second. We're obviously naturally behind on board quite a lot with Sera Valkyrie and Sera negative decks in general, because you play a lot of your cards in the final turns of the game, so you should have priority second, and that means even if your opponent plays on that lane, we're going to set their card's power to 3 before we then up ours in a pinch on the final turn of the game. Then what I particularly like about her is she's a fine 5-cost card to replace the missing Sera when you don't draw them. Similarly to what you would normally do on turn 6, dropping Valkyrie on a full lane on turn 5, setting you up to win that lane, can be very, very powerful. It'll also give value to cards like Bast or Okoye, which we would otherwise just dump onto a lane we don't expect to be fighting for, by giving them relevant bodies late in the game. Now that lane can change at any moment because Valkyrie is in the deck. Doing so, we free up our turn 6 to contest another lane instead of choosing to fight every lane with the ability of Sera. Something that's quite difficult to do if we don't draw Sera normally and haven't played proactively early on. Now we can try to rely on a card like Brood plus Wolfbane to win another lane, or a Nova Mr. Sinister Killmonger turn, for example. It's not as good as when we get our signature card, obviously, but Valkyrie changes a clear retreat situation into a potential win, and that's enough for us to like the card in the deck early and find it very, very exciting. Up next, we have a fantastic one here in Galactus Destroyer. Really cool to see the big kingpin of Series 5, well, one of them at least, finding a home in a deck like this. Electro has always been a kind of card that's been on the fringes of Marvel Snap, and ever since we found its go-to build, the card has managed to become somewhat relevant, yet never managing to become a staple in the metagame. The situation might not have changed, but it feels like this archetype is a great starting point if we want to assess what can be done with Galactus. The whole point of Galactus is either to find a way to keep a lane empty, empty, or playing it before the last turn in order to make a play into that lane afterwards. In this deck, you have the ability to do both, and we didn't really have to change the archetype very much to enable us to do it. Here's an idea of how every single card in this deck kind of helps benefit you with Galactus. You've obviously got things like Hobgoblin, the best setup in the game, making your Galactus way more likely to win the lane it gets played on. You have a card like Leader here, an insane follow-up to Galactus if you can ramp it out early, as you'll only lose to somebody who's able to play 3 or more cards in turn 6. Aero is a fantastic way of keeping a lane clean for you, giving you a shot to play Galactus much more safely on turn 6 following it. Shang-Chi, because people tend to play high power cards when they only have a single lane, is a pretty useful tool to have access to in a deck like this. Destroyer, even when nerfed, still a huge amount of points, usually the best if we only have one card in play, otherwise in the form of Galactus itself. Daredevil, with Electro, we usually want to play a Galactus on turn 5, where we have 6 mana available. More information about where we should be playing it where possible is always going to be welcome in that sense. And of course, he still plays very, very well with Professor X. Speaking of Professor X, he doesn't directly help us in what we're trying to do here, but if the opponent thought he had a lane guaranteed because your Professor X failed, just destroy that lane, which is a really sweet backup plan, I suppose. Wave is also fantastic in this deck as another way to Galactus early so you can be more flexible later on, and of course the remainders of this shell very much kind of the expected parts of a traditional Destroyer list that isn't based on the ongoing synergies. There are definitely other worthy inclusions in this deck. We could see things like Gamora benefiting from Daredevil and Galactus over Professor X. Death is a card that we've seen included in a lot of the Galactus builds so far, as she can be reduced by a lot with Galactus destroying the other locations. Green Goblin, acting as a cheaper copy of Hobgoblin, setting up Galactus even more, although we will, almost will always favour Wave or Electro on turn 3 if that's a play that we can make, if available. Lastly, the idea of Valkyrie has been tossed around in this deck as well, as she will win you the lane as long as your opponent cannot match the amount of cards there, although it does make the goblins pretty much unusable if that's a setup that you're trying to appeal to. Sabretooth and Wolverine also potentially nice additions to this archetype as they contribute for free once they've been destroyed by Galactus, but push the build in a completely different direction. We look forward to kind of seeing how this archetype evolves, whether you should be more death-centric and destroy-centric, or more destroyer-centric and ramp-centric with Electro and Wave. A lot of growth here, a lot of things to try, and it's a very exciting time to be a Destroyer main. Speaking of death, the next deck we want to take a look at is She-Hulk Deathwave. Unsurprisingly, pretty great as advertised, although maybe a little bit soft to Leader all around. When She-Hulk was, speculated to be a Nexus event card during the summer, a lot of players started building around her already, and only had to dig out their old builds when she became available for real this week. Back then, the synergy with Wave immediately felt logical for a lot of deck builders, with She-Hulk offering a very similar way of cheating on resources like Death does. Compared to our previous entries, however, She-Hulk isn't a card that really creates a new pattern for a deck like Valkyrie or Galactus. Instead, the card makes the deck more reliable at something it was already trying to do. When you manage to find both Death and She-Hulk, you can have some of the most disgusting turn 6s possible, mixing both tons of power and a flexible spread, as long as you've got enough destroys off to get a zero-cost death. The need to reduce death to 0 instead of 2 now so that She-Hulk can be played in addition to another 4-cost card makes the deck evolve a little bit. Mostly Squirrel Girl now feels like a bit more of a staple, as she represents 3 bodies you can kill with your Killmonger for 1 card. Otherwise, the rest of the build feels very close to what Bayro was before Series 4 and 5 joined the game, with Leader looking to be the most popular 12th card for now, mostly to be so strong in the mirror match, but we could definitely see a card like this being a copy of America Chavez, or a card like Magneto instead. Definitely look forward to seeing how this one evolves moving forward. I know some creators out there, including KM Best, are working on lists that include cards like Debris to try and have some counterplay against a card like Leader from the opponent. So plenty of room to grow on this one with a very obvious strong top end. One of my personal favourite inclusions in this archetype so far has been exploring the idea of playing with Moon Girl, a card that mostly has fallen out of favour across the metagame, to give us access to multiple copies of She-Hulk and Death, but that play pattern does largely feel like overkill more than particularly good. Up next, another deck that I personally have built myself to play on the ladder because it seems like it was one of the more fun things to do, but definitely one of the higher end ones as it requires 2 Series 5 cards to play. The Bounce archetype welcomes in Bast and Thanos. This is something that Den and myself were both really waiting on when we saw the new 16 cards that were coming to the game. We obviously expected the good decks to become better, but the real excitement comes when the somewhat less good decks manage to join in on the fun. Bounce has been an archetype that's been stuck around around our tier 4 in our tier list for a while now, either getting destroyed by Killmonger or simply not finding enough stats to be able to compete on their average draw step. Bast joining this deck feels like a bit of a given, as every card in the archetype is a low point scorer before growing while it's in play. Also, the ability to bounce the card back to your hand means you can boost your hand stats up several times over the course of a game, affecting more than just your starting hand, for example. Thanos, on the other hand, was not so obvious as an inclusion in the bounce archetype, but has had an incredible impact on this deck early, at least more so the Infinity Stones that come from it. With many ways of abusing cheap cards in this deck, either buffing or replaying them for their on-reveal ability, the Stones have become a new foundation for this archetype all around. They play exceptionally well with Quinjet and Bast, and of course replacing themselves is very, very strong. As a result, we're seeing some other cards make their way into the bounce deck, such as Carnage to free up some much needed space on board, things like Blue Marvel in order to buff our full board at the end of the game. We've also considered seeing Valkyrie in this deck at some point as well, for a very similar thought process to a lot of the decks we've featured her in already, being able to buff those stones across the board on the final turn of the game. But we haven't had the chance to try her utility in this deck yet, simply because neither of us that are working on this arc will have access to her just yet. Also, a somewhat surprising inclusion from the earlier versions of this deck is Devil Dinosaur, who benefits an absolute load from the stones drawing you chunks of cards and you always having a very, very full hand when you're playing this deck. If She-Hulk is great in Deathwave and Galactus is a fine card if it's being cheated in on turn 6, we are very, very happy people, I think, here over at Marvel Snap Zone. I have to admit, not all of us thought Valkyrie would be as impactful as she seems to be early. I personally love the card, and I really can't wait to get my hands on it to see what it does myself, and not just have to infer from other people's gameplay and experiences. But so far, she seems like one of the stronger cards you can play in a lot of decks so far, finding a way to contribute in many, many different ways. The best news all round here, though, is that some fringe archetypes are finally finding some love and competitive relevancy thanks to some brand new shiny cards. To us, this is the biggest indicator that things are changing and that new tools being added to Marvel Snap will make an impact every time they are done so. Even more so given that we expect Silver Surfer next week, which should of course add a brand new axis to the ladder play with more exciting decks on the way. I'm sure that new things are going to keep emerging as players keep unlocking more and more cards, and I can't wait to see what everyone comes up with. If you want to report on your innovative brews, let us know what you've been working on. Feel free to comment in the comments section down below. Come and visit our community Discord with more than 4,000 members talking Marvel Snap 24/7, and let us know what you're up to. And we hopefully can see you on Twitter as well if you'd like to tag us over at Marvel Snap Zone. If you haven't already, please do consider subscribing to us on this channel. We appreciate all the love and support, and putting out this content has been very fun for us so far. So if you want to see more of it, make sure you like the video, leave a comment down below for me, subscribe and turn on notifications. Hopefully, we'll have some shiny goodies to show you in a tier list at the start of next week based on these early opinions being formed by these cards. And until then, I have been HowlingMines, you have been amazing, and this has been Marvel Snap Zone. Take care now.